I call this like a taxonomy of production agents. I guess so. Some questions, I'm kind of curious, like who here has shipped an agent into production, and it's like sort of like if you could just maybe type in, what kind of agent you've shipped into production. I think we'd find that like really interesting.
You can react with
Taxonomy of
a
production
thumbs up on
agents.
Riverside if you've shipped an agent into prod, and a thumbs down if you haven't. Okay, I'm
So
seeing a lot of
some
thumbs up. So I
questions,
think we've found
I'm
our audience, Sam. This might be a very concentrated audience of builders. I like it.
yeah, yeah. Um, Yeah. No, awesome. Like a bunch of browsing agents, lots of different things. Okay, cool. So good to kind of hear and see what folks are shipping. Okay, here we go. So I
There's some
think like
specifics
other
here as well. Ollie mentioned they built an agent that tracks pricing changes of the new models
hmm
being released. Someone else
hmm
mentioned an agent built on GitHub, an
hmm
orchestrator agent.
yeah. And then, also like feel free to like drop something in if you've worked on it or you're working on an agent but maybe hasn't shipped into production yet, right? Like that counts too, obviously. So, feel free to drop that in the chat as well. So these are some of the, different companies we've, met over just like a selection over the last 18 months. Seeing people build things with Mastra. And when we kind of like zoom out, we sort of get to this like taxonomy of like really three different types of agents that we see people building. The, and so we'll kind of like go through them in turn. And the high level, we have like customer facing agents, um, you know, uh, internal agents, and then what we'll call like developer platform agents.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah. So if you're on a user facing product team, like this is pretty straightforward for you. Your app, might have a web app, you might have a mobile app, and then increasingly, right, you're starting to embed like an agent within the web app and the mobile app, where part of and it's in a lot of ways like what we see people building is it's a separate interface, and we you should think about this as a separate interface. One of the interesting things that we've seen from some larger sort of these orgs building on us is that a lot of these are very well developed apps. So, for example, Factorial is a whole HRIS with 14, 15,000 organizations using them, and they've got like payroll, they've got and all the things you need to do to be an HR information, to like store all of your employees' data, right? So there's a lot of functionality there, and one of the things they needed to do as they were building their assistant was that they would sort of in many ways it was like a screen. Every screen that they had, every action that you could do through the web or through mobile, they kind of had to port that over to letting the agent do that, and so they had a lot of like sub agents, right? And
This is
that's
like a HR platform, basically. You could compare it to like a Rippling or a Deal or something like that.
yeah.
Um, that's like very sensitive territory, right? Because you could increase someone's pay or authorize, something very sensitive related to HR. I'm sure that would come with some challenges.
They had a really interesting way of doing authentication. They were thinking of rolling their own sort of like agent authentication, but what they actually decided to do is just let the agent inherit the user's permissions. So if the user has the permissions to do an action, then the agent does, and if not, I mean, and the user tries to, even if the user convinces the agent to try to like increase their salary or whatever, and they don't have access to increase their salary, it'll just return like an error code, because like if you sent that same API request to the back end, even if you figured out how to format it, you'd also get an error code, right? Because you don't have permissions to perform that action in the
I think that's
system.
such a good takeaway because there's layers to this, right? You might update the prompt and say, don't let someone increase their own salary, but that's so vulnerable to like exploitation. Then you can have things like guardrails, but actually tying the auth model to your existing app makes it sounds very robust.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was. I mean, that was like the number one thing that we're thinking about is how we have a very strong permissioning model, and how do we get our agent to inherit that? And like a lot of engineering challenges, they decided that sometimes like the best solution is the most simple solution. Just inherit the user's permissions, right? Um, and an interesting thing. So when we think about when we think about user and customer facing agents, there's sort of the B2B version, but there's also kind of like the B2C version. And so a lot of these are a lot of really interesting use cases for like financial planning, which is like range for sort of like um, car sales, that's car gurus, like councils, like a health use case. Um, Indeed is obviously a career use case. I think that Indeed is a user we like talking about a lot because I think it kind of shows the power of building agents and kind of creating a type of experience that you couldn't have had before. So what they
Hmm.
did was they built this like career counselor agent. And if you think about Indeed as a platform, right, they have some like proprietary data. They have like all this jobs data, and sort of like that nobody else has. They have all these salary data that no one else has, and so like they're actually in this like really unique position to create this experience, and then like simultaneously like their users are kind of coming here asking questions about, hey, here's my resume. I want to get this kind of job in like 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. Like, what do I need to do now to get there? And so they have this kind of like data set that nobody has, and then people are bringing, their own sort of personal information, right? So I think like the cool thing we've been able to see a lot of these like companies do is just create these like personalized experiences over kind of proprietary data.
Hmm. I think there's like, again, levels to this because sometimes with B2C or B2B assistants, like your users are just copying stuff and pasting it into like something like
Yeah.
ChatGPT and then pasting it back in. So that's like level one. You give them that experience in app and increase the retention. But then there are things that an agent can only do if it has access to that proprietary data. And that becomes a context engineering challenge, basically.
Yeah, no, for both B2B and kind of like B2C. I mean, one of the other interesting so like one of the things that Factorial kind of saw is that a lot of their users were just doing CSV dumps, pasting that into ChatGPT.
That's not good for sensitive employee
No,
information.
not good. And then like even beyond that, right? There's another problem, which is that like there you might have a lot of like company specific data, like policies and stuff in your HR system, right? And so if you're just doing CSV dumps and pasting it into chat, it might give you the wrong answer, not because, it's a bad model, but but because it doesn't have access to the context that it needs to make the right decision, which is, maybe some of those policies and procedures that are like company specific.
Yeah. Ty
Um,
here says that, uh, sorry, the chat's jumping around a little bit. It's a good problem to have. There's a lot of activity. Um, Ty mentioned, yes, that putting that kind of stuff in a prompt is bad. Hooks are much better for it.
yeah.
Keep your questions coming, and we'll definitely find a good slot to ask them when they're relevant to the slides.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a lot of conversations about how to build particular agents. So yeah, I love the conversation over there in the chat. Uh, let's see. So some of the like one of the other interesting things we've seen, okay, cool. There's like obviously like pretty cool things you can do here, but when you're sort of like actually doing this and kind of rolling it out into production, there's like two things that we see, teams spend a lot of time and effort to get right. Um, and so that's kind of cost optimization and accuracy. And so I think like a good way of talking about this is just I kind of put together like some timelines of these teams and like their journey to kind of like roll out to production. So the first thing I'll say is that, obviously the time to roll out to production is a factor of like the complexity of what you're building. Factorial to port sort of every screen of their like complex app over to this agent, right? So that like kind of like took time. It also kind of rewards folks that have built before. So Council Health had someone come over from Google DeepMind to join their team, and that person like had a lot of experience building agents, and so they were able to kind of, make a choice on technology and framework like very quickly, and then it sort of like helped the team sort of just they had seen the patterns to kind of like
Hmm.
move before. Obviously for most of us, for most folks, they're going through and building, and probably most of the people in this chat, you're probably building, an agent for you're probably relatively new to building agents, and that's okay too. Like, the thing that we've seen, like, what happens, and there's this like crucial moment, kind of as you start by, as you're kind of like prototyping, and then you're sort of starting to productionize the agent, and then you're like, okay, cool, like we have this is working. We have maybe some set of internal evals or whatever. We're feeling confident about this. We have not yet gotten, like, a ton of user feedback, other than, like, whatever kind of like customer interviews and like that type of stuff that you're doing. And so what folks we often see folks doing is rolling out like an early access program. And what they'll often see in this early access program is they'll see users throwing new types of prompts into the system that they hadn't seen earlier, and so they have the chance to kind of like make sure their like agents work well for those prompts. They also get to understand the cost considerations of running this at scale. There are, I think the Sanity team, there was like a user or two that was costing like hundreds or maybe $1,000 per month in tokens to kind of serve, and they were like, okay, like, how should we optimize our tokens spend, right? Are there particular like agent loops that are costing more versus others? And so the early access kind of programs that we've seen these teams doing is a great way of you know optimizing, but also like sort of bucketing the challenge. You don't have to worry and fix your cost here if you can fix it here. And so if folks are concerned early on, hey, but like, how much is this going to cost us? Are we just going to be paying our entire revenue stream to Anthropic to, like, to sort of
Mm.
ship this feature? And you can say, like, look, no, I don't think so, but like we can roll this out in early access, and scale it up just to make sure that's not the case, and optimize it, so that it won't be the case, right?
So you're talking about rolling this out incrementally to users and then only
Yeah, starting
expanding
with
it
an
when you feel more confident.
Yeah, and we often do see them using these types of early access programs where they'll say, like, hey, fill out this form to opt in, as well as doing the traditional sort of like scaled up to 1% of users, 5% of users, 10% of users, and then, everybody.
I think with agents, one of the biggest challenges is that you don't really know how users are going to use them. And so that could be surprising in different ways. It could be good surprising when they go deeper into your product, but it could also be bad surprising when you run into edge cases or cost problems. So phasing it out sounds like quite a reasonable approach to manage kind of going to market with this feature, but also managing the risk.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. I mean, like, so Sanity, for example, like as a CMS, right? There's a lot of different types of content workflows, and they saw, they were surprised by the diversity of these types of use cases. So sometimes someone had, like, let's say that they were storing, they're a retail chain, and they have like 3,000 stores, and they wanted to like do some bulk data updates. People were uploading like CSVs with bulk data updates to their agent, and like Sanity had initially thought about this as, well, like maybe it's like more for content gaps, or like maybe it's like drafting content, and they hadn't thought about like the bulk content update use case, but they kind of got to optimize that during the early adoption period, or the early access period.
How do you recommend people keep costs in control, even in situations they haven't anticipated? Like the agent getting stuck in a loop or a user just hammering the endpoint with huge data using lots of tokens. What kind of guardrails would you recommend people put in place to feel good about their budget?
I mean, the first thing is observability. So, for we have inside Monster Studio, per kind of like uh, per trace costing, of tokens, and usually what it is that you can downgrade from like maybe a frontier model to serving some types of requests with a cheaper model, or maybe you're switching from Anthropic to GLM, or like an open source model. But what you do have to do is you do have to be sure with your sort of set of evals that the changes you're making are not degrading. You have to be targeted, so you can sort of target your highest your highest cost queries, You can think about, maybe there's a specific thing where like an agent is running in a loop, but it would like some of what they're wanting to do is just more deterministic, and so you create a workflow for that specific case. Some of it is prompt engineering, sort of like model swapping. All of it is backed by kind of your visibility into cost, as well as your sort of sets of evals that give you kind of the controls around and the visibility around the quality of the answers that you're giving to users.
That's such a good point because you could open up your inference provider's dashboard and see a big bill, but that won't tell you exactly where the inference spend came from. That's where observability and traces are so important because, as the old adage goes, you can't improve what you can't measure. I think you
Absolutely.
also need like hard guardrails and probably layers of guardrails as well. So, for example, in Maestro, we have a cost guard processor that stops your agent from exceeding a certain token threshold for a particular run or session. You can dial that in. Another thing I've seen people feel better about is when they set hard limits in their gateway provider so that they physically can't spend more than a certain amount per day, for example, without some override. And of course, you'll have alerting and stuff around that to increase it if needed.
Yeah. Um, and then no, absolutely, and I think those are all like, once you figure out what you need to fix and where you need to fix it, like Monster will have the tools to do it, but you got to figure out what you got to do first, and
There's a
then
few related questions. For example, Prior here asked about how to manage changing models, upgrading a model, and knowing things that are actually getting better instead of worse.
I mean that's where sort of like so there's kind of like two bits of that. There's kind of the evals bit, which is knowing it, and then Monster has a built-in model router, so you can kind of switch between provider. You're just changing a string, from Anthropic Claude Opus 4.8 to ZAI GLM 5.2 or whatever, within the code. Uh, and then like we kind of for non for more general audiences, like one of the things that we see is that because like these are it's important to keep in mind these are success stories, right? And like most um like in most things, for these teams, there are like other teams that didn't make it, right? Maybe the project got killed along the way, or maybe they felt like they couldn't solve one of the problems. But these are success cases, and so we kind of tell people like if you want to maximize your chance of like making it through all the way and getting this into production, having this be a successful like ship, right? You kind of have a choice of like, hey, should I roll my own primitives, and all my features, or should I just kind of like take some good off the shelf primitives that work well together and compose well, and then like focus on my user's experience. And we obviously we're a framework, so we're a little biased here, but we tend to encourage folks to like use a framework that you like and are comfortable with, rather than there are teams that would really rather that like kind of like try to roll their own primitives, and then they need to just like update things as like new primitives come out a lot, and then they kind of they're always like they get into this thing where, well, we can't ship this feature because we don't have this new primitive or this new feature on this primitive, and they end up in this kind of like maintenance thing versus just using a great framework that helps them move faster. Um, I think that's like our last advice on kind of like customer facing agents. But I'll kind of like shift over to internal agents a little bit. We can like dive in a little bit there. So just so we're also kind of clear, because we're section transitioning, right?
Hmm.
Internal agents tend to be built in like larger institutions. So if you have 1,000 employees or 10,000 employees, if you work in an organization like that, and maybe anyone that works in an organization like that can just drop a message in the chat. You don't have to necessarily say the name of your organization, but maybe if it's like, say, the type of your organization, I work at like a East Asian bank or whatever it might be, right? Like um, but like so some of the things in these kinds of companies, is that like there's so many more internal surface areas because they're so large, right? Any organism that's larger has like a relatively larger ratio of internal, volume or whatever to like external surface area. And it's just like a law of physics. And so there's like relatively more things going on inside these organizations, that is kind of actually interesting, from an agent building perspective. And so this is kind of this use case is increasingly being called company brain. It sort of initially was called
Hmm.
enterprise search, and like the trendy term now is company brain. You can use
I
whatever
like
term you
that.
want.
I like that more.
Yeah,
Definitely.
it's definitely like a catchy name. But we saw so. Um,
What would be the distinction between a company knowledge base and a company brain?
so the company knowledge base tends to be seen more as like, yeah, well, we have all of our docs in a wiki or something like that. Whereas a company brain, is more like, well, and we can kind of like actively search that to find all the information we need, agentically.
And then do something with it.
Yeah, exactly. Uh, and, yeah, I think you've captured the distinction well. So, we see, a lot of these like larger companies as well. They might have grown through acquisition, right? And so they actually might be, 100 underlying kind of like companies that have like their own, sets of systems. And then like, people are in one entity, but they need information from another entity or like, et cetera. And so, the permissioning around this stuff is hard, right? Like if you work in one of these organizations, like, it just, there's a lot of different groups around and they all have their own ways of doing things, yet they have to work together, to achieve like sort of like important company projects. And so, we see a lot of folks, a lot of these larger orgs having initiatives. So like for Marsh McLennan, they're like a insurance company, although there's a lot of different, subgroups of that. And they kind of built these kind of company brains using Mastra that they've like rolled out to like, huge numbers of employees. We also see a lot of kind of like internal process automation. This is especially common for like, financial companies, for like healthcare companies. Brex sort of notably like used us, and there was an article that like, Swix and Latent Space had about them like the week, it was actually like right before their like Capital One acquisition, which is pretty cool. They'd sort of
Is
started
it
with,
the full story of Brex's AI Hail Mary?
yeah, that's it. If you
I'll
if
pop a link
you
in the chat.
Yeah, it's a great article, but they kind of walk through how, they'd sort of started with their own internal agent framework, and then they'd actually run into the challenge that we talked about earlier, where it was like, hey, do you want to keep building and maintaining this thing, or do we want to, use a bunch of engineers started using Mostra, and they started moving much faster, in certain parts of the product. But in any case, like there's a lot of these like, whenever you see a lot of like paperwork, to process. This is like a really good use case for agents. I mean,
Speaking of speed, Justin had a number one challenge that they shared, which is the sort of process to get buy-in and to align people on decision making to allow agents to be built. Someone else, I think Shreyas, made the point that working with a data layer in an enterprise can be very challenging as well. And it sounds kind of related because we're talking about permissions over data and stuff. What
yeah,
advice would you share to people to build agents more quickly in enterprise environments?
yeah. I mean, I think this is actually it's funny you kind of like mentioned that. This is kind of like the next thing, or that like folks are mentioning that there's often like the thing about these types of orgs is that there can often be like a disconnect between kind of like the leadership perception and then like the kind of like the facts on the ground, where like you run into these random blockers where, I mean, people weren't like anticipating that was a blocker, but you can't get access to some data schema or taxonomy that you would need to like build an agent or whatever. um we generally just tend to encourage folks to be a little creative, kind of go off book. Like maybe the best agents to like build are not the ones on the team that you're assigned to. Maybe you have to sort of like embed in another team. Maybe like you don't, maybe you're like doing this, maybe you're building agents on the side while your actual job is like something else. Nobody might like commissioned and blessed this project, but like maybe like we see folks having success that are just kind of going a little off book, being a little creative, and sort of finding the opportunities.
Mm.
Like a lot of times, like as an engineer, you kind of have to put on a little bit of like a PM hat or whatever. Like, okay, but like how should this process work? Like, what would we like to like have happen here? Um, I think
So
like yeah.
suppose there are different teams in an organization, and maybe they've built their own types of agents with access to this data. Do they have to sort of abandon everything and build a new agent in Mastra? Or is there a way for them to like interoperate that might help cross team boundaries more politically and technically efficiently?
Yeah, I mean, Master has ADA support, which is something that we hear mostly from, folks inside these larger organizations that have these coordination issues. Because from a VP or senior director perspective, they might just say like, hey, like y'all build agents however you want to build agents, but like just make sure they can talk to each other, right? I think it's like a very common like, executive or middle manager thing to say like, let a thousand flowers bloom, but make sure that they can all work with each other. Um, uh, and so that's one of the reasons why we invested in our A-to-A support was hearing this kind of feedback from users. Uh, and I'll kind of like move on to the last bit, and hopefully there's some time for. I want to leave some time for answering questions in chat at the end, which is, what we call like developer platform agents, which is like inside most large engineering organizations, there's a platform team that is responsible for developer productivity. It's responsible for infrastructure, for these like shared concerns that make the whole engineering org valuable. And often at scale, like what that looks like is that you end up with these huge streams of like machine data and something like a network operations center or an internal CI system. And like this is actually like a really great place to build an agent. So I was just talking to the EM or the engineering lead at Mongo that sort of was responsible for this project. He was sort of like maybe the first one to like get the agent bug, and then like now about like 20 different folks inside their infra team are using Monster, which is really cool. But they have this sort of whole internal CI system where like they have 100,000 EC2 servers every day that are running CI jobs for devs within Mongo, right? There's a lot of devs within Mongo that are like running CI to like ship PRs. And when something's anomalous in that CI system, they want to have reliable infrastructure to run these jobs. Like they don't have a search system to like look through the logs. It's just like too much data, and so they kind of built an agent to sort of and like you can do an investigation, but you're sort of like manually scrolling through logs and like this can take kind of like hours to like debug at any particular failure just because it's and so they built an agent to do a lot of this kind of stuff, which like has been like very well received among the team. Um, the Workday example is kind of from their network operations center, which is basically that's kind of responsible for triaging these kinds of like incoming, like automatically generated security alerts, and kind of deciding which ones are important. And so they were sort of they built an agent to sort of process the stream of data, which they've sort of they sort of built it on a previous architecture, and they found that like actually when they used sort of like a Mastra agent to process this versus kind of pre-encoding it all and putting together like RAG pipeline, there were like significant cost savings, which I thought was like pretty interesting. Um, uh, and I think like the other type of like thing that we see these dev teams doing is that those sort of you know a lot of like what they in if you sit inside these teams, like people are always like coming to you being like, I want to do X, what's the right way of doing X at this company, right? And so your job is to almost make a blessed way of doing it, so that like everyone, it just makes it easier to align. And so these teams have kind of built these internal agent platforms where the right way of making agents inside the Mongo, inside the Mongo org, there's like a light wrapper with some Mongo specific stuff on top of like a Monster agent, or like that's also similar for like what Salesforce is kind of like working on for some of their developer community as well.
So this is where like an engineer maybe creates a setup with certain tools with access to certain data sources, also some permissions things, and then they give this agent builder to maybe like GTM people, maybe to marketing people, and then they can prompt or drag and drop and configure some agent within those parameters into existence, so they can craft it to whatever problem they're trying to solve without having necessarily to be an engineer.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you know like the or if they're just building agents inside like maybe some part of the product that they own, or again there's a ton of different products and SKUs inside these companies at this scale. And so a team off at in sort of like three levels of hierarchy down, like the sort of the product SKU directory is like, now that team can be empowered. Like they don't have to reinvent the wheel of how to do it. They can just use the blessed way of doing things at this company.
I have a quick fun question for you, Sam. What type of internal agents is Mastra building and using?
I mean, we have a ton of stuff. So like Misha from our team, who's a customer engineer, leads a lot of that. But we have a lot of product agents, so being able to ask, hey, like, can you tell me all users that have like mentioned this problem in our customer calls, or like in our in our Slack channels. We call that one Vox. Um, uh, we have like some content agents that help kind of like pre-draft some of our like feature releases, although we like to like edit that with a human voice after the content agent gives us kind of the V1. um I mean, there's but like being able to like sort of aggregate a lot of the internal data is really valuable. If you Google like Mostra internal agents, and then like you'll probably find Misha's post on our blog. I think his post is called like product agents we built at Mostra. Um, Yeah, I mean, obviously something we think about a ton, and really like the dimensions and vectors here are like sort of, hey, can we connect? And keep in mind, we're not a large organization, right? We're about like 30 folks. So, but even within a 30-person organization, there's all these like user calls that we have. There's all these like Slack channels that we have. There's all of like our, customer data and our CRM, right? And it's just a lot easier to do like these analytical type, so much of like analytical type work is like, once if you've got all the data in one place, and then, an agent is kind of like processing them, like it just makes figuring out these kinds of things a lot easier, and making decisions, like product type decisions, a lot easier. What should we focus on? Oh, it turns out 17 people have like asked about this feature, and like three people have asked about that feature. Unless we have a really good reason to work on feature two, whereas this feature one, we're probably going to work on feature one, right? Like,
I
uh,
like that a lot because it's the kind of insight that you wouldn't be able to get easily before having an agent. Like it would take a lot of manual combing through and time and effort. But now people can prompt it if they're curious, but also the agents can synthesize information. So they could actively be looking at, for example, meeting transcripts, drawing out insights, and then on some kind of schedule, maybe using a scheduled workflow, you could get a notification. And that's a good sort of segue actually to a quick question about where do you interact with these internal agents?
Yeah, I mean, like Slack, right? I mean, we are addicted to Slack as an organization. We are power users. We have sort of automated flows where when people sign up for our platform, certain types of organizations, will get invites to get like Slack connects with our organization. So like we live in Slack, and our agents live in Slack too, just like our colleagues.
So here's what we're going to do, Sam. I'm going to pass it over to you to take this presentation out. And in the meantime, I'll keep an eye on the chat and start collecting some questions for Q&A at the end. So for you folks watching, please drop your question. And if perhaps you dropped it earlier and you don't feel like it's been seen, that's just because the chat is moving so fast, it's easy to miss. Feel free to drop them again and we'll try and tackle a
Seeing a
few.
tab, and I don't know if it's screen shared, but it's like 52 new messages. And it's like, it's great to see it. everyone kind of like chatting. And I don't know, this is part of like why we love doing these events is for us to chat with you and it's for you all to chat with each other. Like I don't know, some of the in some ways like we hope to distill kind of like the best of the knowledge, but like so much of it is like people point to point sharing of our users with each other. And I think like the last thing I'll say on this topic, and this is kind of we're kind of closing out the material that I have, um, is that the cool thing about this kind of agent is that you're really building for yourself as a developer, right? You're kind of solving your own problem, which means that that feedback loop can go a lot faster. You don't need to necessarily, I mean, if you do, that's cool too, but like you can move faster without having to go ask a bunch of users, hey, like, what are you wanting from this agent? What are you concerned about? Because like you are your own user. And so that's one of the, obviously that's one of the things we've seen teams be able to go really fast because they're able to just build for themselves here. Um, and I mean, I think like look the cool thing about being alive and being a developer and doing AI today in 2026 is just seeing all the different things people are doing. So hopefully this is a little bit of insight into like what we're seeing. User facing, customer facing agents, right? Inside, organizations that have a user surface area, internal agents within larger, especially within larger organizations, um, and then like developer platform agents. And then obviously there's lots of internal type use cases that are happening even in orgs of our size, that are kind of like worth calling out as well. But lots of exciting stuff going on. So let's hop on over to the chat, I guess, and some Q&A.
Yeah, let's pause the screen share and turn our attention to the chat. Someone asked if Vox, the internal agent you mentioned before, is open source. I believe it's in a private repository right now.
Yeah, I think so. But take a look at like Misha's blog post. I mean, like there's not a like I wouldn't say that Vox is a terribly sophisticated agent. It connects to our Fireflies. I think this agent didn't. We've made a few iterations of it, but the power is in the connections and a basic prompt.
We're going back a little bit to this idea of B2C agents that you mentioned at the beginning. How are companies pricing these agents? What kind of models are they using? How are they thinking about how to create value?
Yeah, I mean, it differs. So, it differs. A lot of the B2C type use cases are, I mean, they are B2C. They're not sort of pure. Maybe I'll just share my screen and pull this up again. Uh, uh, but let me, oops. I guess to share the screen, entire or window. Here we go. So I think a lot of these are not kind of for example, like CarGurus is not the agent is kind of free, right? So it's just the agent is driving the car sales, which is what the company's making money on. Indeed, I think like what they're driving is they're driving sort of like engagement with their platform and sort of like user applications to jobs. Maybe it'll suggest some jobs to you that you can apply to. So it's y- y- Range, Range is a financial advisor, and so the way that they make money is they sort of take a percentage of like fraction of a percent of your money every year as kind of like a advisory fee.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, so I mean, there's a lot. In some ways, like the best way of pricing is free if you have a business model that can support that, where your agent is driving like a metric that matters.
I think that definitely works as long as your agent doesn't cost too much, right? And that's where cost
Yeah,
optimization comes into the mix, like using cheaper models, for example, or
yeah.
only giving pro users access to the more sophisticated
I
reasoning
mean,
models.
I was in a really interesting conversation with a CEO like a couple months back where I was kind of it was more of a B2B than B2C use case, but I was delivering a invective against like credit-based schemes because I was like personally I just like look, tell me if I'm like buying build minutes, like charge me for build minutes, charge me for CPU time, charge me for charge me for like something that I as a developer understand. And like the CEO was like, look, like we in the sea of like a unicorn is like, yeah, like I hear you, but also like we need to have flexibility to price this. So that's why I'm shipping a credit a system to like price our
Yeah.
new sort of agent, our new kind of like agent product within their within their tool, which I won't go. I don't want to like I don't want to talk too much about what the specific use case was, but it, like the CEO said that like they thought they would probably make about as much money from the agent as they did from their software. And if you look at sort of like I think Notion has shared their revenues. I think their revenue split between their SaaS and their agent, and I think their agent is making them about as much money as they're getting from SaaS revenue. So it's a really, I mean, from a new revenue stream standpoint, like it's really interesting. I'm gonna stop going on this like sort of like pricing nerd thing, but like
It's
it is
fascinating though.
yeah,
Yeah.
it is really fascinating to watch how this stuff is evolving.
Because like credits do make sense because they're flexible, but also users hate having to do maths and like they don't know
Yeah.
how long those
No,
credits are
exactly.
going to take them. So
Yeah.
that kind of sucks. And then the other thing that's hard for us as builders is that um, you don't necessarily know, like with an API call to an old web server, you know it's like one request. But an agent has this loop, right, where it could do 10 tool calls or it could go for a long time. It could have a bunch of context. So it gets really hard to like model that pricing. Um, and yeah, the other thing that comes to mind is there's some new interesting pricing structures evolving. For example, if the goal of an agent is to accomplish a task, maybe you could charge based on successful task completion. And that's what a lot of support agents, most famously Finn, will do. That's like a totally new world, and it's so early.
Yep, absolutely. No, we're still figuring out how this stuff works, right? Like there's the technology itself, and like there's the model, then there's like the agent around it, then there's kind of like the productizing of that agent, then there's the pricing around it. These are all kind of like concentric circles, and you figure them out from the inwards outwards, right? That's the whole story of technology diffusion into the world. That's how this always works.
There was a question here about uh, building Mastra agents against different like clouds, different inference providers. Someone here asks about Azure and making their product model agnostic with Mastra.
The great news is that Monster is model agnostic out of the box, right? It's also cloud agnostic out of the box. There are some, there's some new frameworks that are coming out that are like from specific cloud providers, and I think like what we tend to tell people about those frameworks is that like if you want to use that cloud provider, if you're sure you want to use that cloud provider, maybe use that framework. But if you want to use something that is portable to a public cloud like Azure or AWS or GCP, right? You probably want to use something that's going to be just open, that's not tied to a specific model provider, that's not tied to a specific infra provider, that you can trust will always be open, always be multi-cloud, multi-model, and give you the flexibility that you need. And that's Mastra.
How does someone make a choice between Mastra, Codex SDK, Cursor SDK, Claude Code SDK, Claude Agents SDK, I guess it's called now?
Yeah, I mean that's actually so. I mean, it kind of comes back to that as well. Like that's how we often. I mean, the codecs and Claude Code SDKs are good, right? Because the underlying product is good. Are they going to be multimodal? Really? And like yes, you could probably like swap out a model if you're have some plugin, but like is the harness really designed to operate with a different model? Not really. They've really just custom designed that harness for that particular model. So like even if you kind of work around their system and like put in a different model, it's not like so. Again, underlying under if you're confident that this is you're always only going to be using models of one provider, yeah, it's probably fine. We do have our new agent controller. API that we shipped that sort of is basically we used to build our own master code, so our own version of Claude Code that our team daily drives, and you can also use the agent controller class to build a type of that experience as well, or you can like have it do a more long running process similar to how the Claude Code or Claude SDK would work.
There's a few questions about if Mastra agents can write code on behalf of the user. I suppose one way to interpret that is like bash is all you need type of thing, where instead of calling tools, it's doing code mode. The other idea could actually be building your own sort of coding agent. And someone noticed we have something called workspaces, and they wondered how that all fits together. Maybe you can give a high level overview.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just like the historical thing is like in January, so we shipped workspaces with support for sandboxes, support for the file system, because we noticed with the rise of Claude Code, et cetera, that this was increasingly something people are wanting agents to do. That kind of there was this convergence between like, what we were talking about now, which is kind of production agents and coding agents. And sometimes like these user facing, agents might be writing code. So we shipped workspaces, we shipped code mode. Um, uh, so that means that the agent can write its own tools, basically, and then our workspace has like again a file system primitive and sandbox primitives with support for multiple providers on each one, right? So, your hey, I want to use S3 as a file system, great. I want to use E2B as a sandbox provider, great. I use Daytona as a sandbox provider, great. Or whatever it might be, right? But it's just a generic interface that like people like we have a lot of plugins for different providers on each.
It seems like the topic of cost stoked the conversation a little bit. It seems to be
We
something
love
that's
talking about it
resonating
because
here.
it's numerical. It's like talking about sports scores. We love talking about costs. It's like a fun numbers thing to talk about.
And the model, the way that Master can use different models, I wanted to go back to something you mentioned earlier about sort of internal agents. Maybe for compliance reasons, you don't want to give all your data for OpenAI, for example, or Anthropic. You might feel, but there are layers to this, right? You might feel better going for an inference provider that you have some type of
Absolutely.
agreement with. They have some policies you like. You might also just want to run your own GPUs. I would personally treat that as a last step. That's my philosophy. But someone here asked about when it makes sense to run data, run inference, like run local models, do your own inference, run your own
Yeah.
GPUs. Have you given that some thought at all, Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I would think about this kind of similarly to like how I would think about, you know, deciding to host your own CPUs, right? So typically, if you make the decision, like Dropbox made this decision, and Hey.com,
Oh, sure,
the
DHH, yeah.
DHH, yeah, made this decision. But like it was almost like going through a process. It's like, okay, like let's start by shipping you just start with the thing that lets you ship fastest,
Yeah.
which is usually the cloud. And then after that, be like, where is the highest level where you can cost optimize that? And then, then like where do you want to go, right? Do you want to go and like rent some, maybe you just want to start by shifting from AWS to like Hertzner or whatever. Maybe you do want to rack your own servers, right? Like where do you want to where do you want to be? How bare metal do you want to go? Do you want to rent the servers? Do you want to rack your own servers, right? So like, but don't, it's probably foolish to like jump multiple steps at a time. Start by the thing that lets you ship quickly, and then sort of, go step by step. You're gonna have to develop the internal capabilities to like deal with, you know, kind of disaster recovery type scenarios
Yeah,
that
yeah. And is that
could
what you
just,
want to be doing at this stage?
and maybe
I'd
it
argue
is, right?
probably not.
Maybe it is, but like I would start with the thing that's easier to ship first, and that's what I advise folks with models as well. Is like, look, just start by using a frontier model, and then look at your cost spend across this, and then decide, hey, these are the workflows I want to ship to GLM on Fireworks, or maybe I want to buy my own GPUs. By the way, it's expensive, and you also have to find your own GPUs, right? So like Nvidia's order
That's also
backlogs are
quite
pretty
tricky
long.
right now.
So
Yeah.
so like you can do that for sure. Um, but it will take some work, and so I would advise doing the thing that lets you ship first and then optimize later. It's like make it work, make it right, make it fast, cheap, etc. That's
Mm,
always the pattern.
damn, I love that. I love how like even though agents is a whole new world, like we're talking about, some of the old engineering adages hold true,
Hmm.
uh, and there's some familiar faces. Like a lot of
Absolutely.
engineers are building agents now, so
I mean, AI engineering is just a branch of software engineering, right? So a
yeah.
lot of the same things that we learned as full stack developers or whatever we are, like we'll carry over to this new world.
So there are like so many amazing questions. I feel so stoked that people are talking among each other, asking such insightful questions. We have time for three more, and I've already picked the three to close this out. I'll just say that someone asked about our top tips for cost optimization. Well, I actually hosted a master workshop about cost optimization previously. So I'll drop a link in the chat that you can dig into if you want to learn more about that. The first question of the three is about memory. Someone asked Sam, what memory options does Mastra have? Do we have some kind of semantic layer? And what else does Mastra offer? And what's our recommendation for memory these days?
So we have a built-in observational memory system that it basically like you can configure the thresholds, but it'll sort of like record up to 40K tokens, in raw kind of like raw, and then it'll kind of compress down to like a memory layer, and then it'll compress the memories further. So it was all, as far as we can tell, it was like the first agentic memory system that was kind of rolled out. Previously a lot of things were like, and we had one as well, but like it was kind of like a RAG based semantic recall. And then what we found was that we actually was that the memory system worked better anecdotally from our use cases that we were using it for. It also performed better on benchmarks such as long mem eval. So we sort of like leaped up the long mem eval scoreboards, and then the other teams that have kind of like done well that are just kind of adopted our approach as well. I mean, I'm glad it's spreading for others as well. It's great, but I really recommend observational memory and agentic sort of like, which is this like agentic memory system with agents doing the compression, right? As a and using that kind of like that comes out of the box with Mostra.
We do have a solution called semantic recall as well, where the inputs and outputs from the agent are stored in a database and they're vectorized. And then in future messages, the memory layer can fetch semantically relevant messages. And it's quite optimized in terms of how the context window is engineered. That can be suitable in some use cases when you're thinking about the data as having like a semantic reference. But the cool thing about observational memory is that the taxonomy, the words you use don't exactly have to be related. And there's some other benefits to do with things like episodic memory and how to handle lots of memories without oversaturating the context window. So generally, we recommend that as a starting point. The other question here was about, so this is from Bomark. They mentioned that their team is focused on saving costs and agents when using browsers. I wanted to call that out because one thing observational memory is great at is compressing tool call results. And when you're automating browsers, the biggest culprit usually is that they return enormous amounts of data into the context window as they scrape a bunch of web pages.
Absolutely, yeah. Observational memory is one like the tool calls and browsers are one of the best use cases for one of the best reasons why observational memory really improves recall. And then someone asked, like, we support, we ship to browsers feature that, through the agent browser library supports libraries like browser use. We're actually also very close to the browser use team. We went through YC together in the same batch, so we're close friends with them as well. Uh,
NASA asked about the recordings. Just so everyone knows, you'll get an email after this event with all the links. And time for our final question. I'm sorry we're ending. Someone wrote that they could join for 2 more hours since we only scratched the surface. Maybe we'll do a part two at some point. Thank you for the kind words. The question was forward looking, Sam. What's on Mastra's roadmap, and what are you personally looking forward to in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, we have some really cool. So we launched observability, uh, in our platform in April, and we're working on more advanced versions of observability. We call like trace intelligence, which is sort of like clustering, et cetera. So we'll have more news. I'll just say we have a conference in about 3 weeks in London. I'm gonna fly to London
Come on
and
over.
get Alex in person, which is great. So we're going to be announcing more about that, but it's easier to figure out what's going on with large volumes of traces with this kind of stuff. In general, like agent learning and continual learning is something we're thinking a lot about right now. How to sort of like take the traces and kind of feed it back and actually make the agent better. So that's something we're spending a lot of time thinking and expect to hear stuff in the future, very soon about that as well.
Just responding to Priya here. They asked about a developer community. Come hang out on Discord and make sure to follow Mastra on X as well, where you'll get a constant trickle of new features.
Yeah.
Keep up if you can, is all I'll say.
Yeah, the community is our favorite part of doing this, honestly. Like, it's great to see what everyone is building, and knowing that we got to be a part of that journey along with you. So that's why we've all been most of the team has been doing commercial open source JavaScript frameworks for almost 10 years now. So we just love being sort of this like relationship we have with the community and getting to build things that people can build cool things with.
Well, thank you so much, Sam, for your time. It's been a pleasure to have you. And thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. We host live events like this weekly, at least a weekly workshop where we teach you how to build a more capable agent, often using Mastra. It's a little bit of a spoiled type of week this week because tomorrow I'm going live with Mastra's other co founder, Shane Thomas, also Mastra's CPO, and we're going to talk about agent factories. And so, or software factories rather. And so, if you've heard that term floating around, you're curious what it could mean for you and your business and your team. Maybe you want to build one and benefit from some of the productivity advantages. We're going to get into all of that. So, make sure to check out the link in the chat and register. Maybe I'll see you there. Any closing words, Sam?
No, this is always fun doing these. It's always great chatting, and thanks for coming. It's great to see y'all.
Peace out, guys. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.